So welcome to our artist talk for Dawn Holder's exhibition, A Glory That May Never. Dawn is an associate professor of art. She teaches ceramics, sculpture, and art history at the University of the Ozarks in Clarksville. She is a recipient of numerous awards and grants, including the Arkansas Arts Council Award for the Individual Artist Fellowship Grant for Sculpture and Installation, the Bagwell Outstanding Faculty Award in 2016, the grand prize at the 59th Delta exhibition at the Arkansas Art Center in 2017, and the grand prize at the 4x4 2018 Midwest Invitational exhibition at the Springfield Art Museum. In 2019, she was awarded grants from the Leighton International Artist Exchange Program and the Arkansas Arts Council Sally A. Williams Fund for the artist residencies in Rome, Italy, and Denmark. Please welcome Dawn for her talk.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.
Hello.
Okay, I'm going to switch over to sharing my screen. So let me start my presenter view. Okay. There we go. Okay. Oops. Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in to my artist talk today. First, I want to thank Dr. Christine Bentley for inviting me to exhibit my work in the Spiva Gallery. And I also want to give a big shout out to the wonderful group of students that helped me unpack and install my work this weekend. Thank you all for making that process go so quickly and smoothly. I think that was one of the fastest installs that I've ever had. And especially thank you to Tracy for staying till the very end, making sure that all of the wall work was hung. I wish that I could be on campus with all of you in person today, but I am grateful that we have access to technology that allows us to connect virtually. And I'm really excited that I get to share my work with you all today. So I'm going to walk you through some earlier work that I've done, and then the talk is going to focus primarily on the monument-based work that is similar to what's in the exhibition. And then I'll save some time at the end for questions. So my work uses sculpture, installation, and photography to reflect and react to the ways local populations alter, cultivate, and mythologize the landscape around them. Over the past decade, I have developed 3 distinct bodies of work that examine landscape as a space that is simultaneously terrestrial and symbolic. A series of perfect porcelain lawns, an investigation of ecological apocalypse, and an exploration of the imagined fall of monuments. I am curious about the way we choose to cultivate and shape the landscape around us. I am curious about the varying messages these decisions send about power dynamics, social status, and environmental priorities. These curiosities underlie all my work. In the US, we have a fascination with cultivating the perfect lawn, spending huge amounts of time and money to create a landscape that is more about appearances than usefulness. My grass variation and suburban lawn iteration series investigate the environmental impact of this monoculture, as well as the lawn's status as social signifier through simplified geometric forms that imply aerial views of suburban neighborhoods. So this image shows one of my earliest lawn pieces. This was first shown in Houston in 2012. Labor and process figure heavily into my work. So for this series, I think I've created at least 100,000 blades of grass, maybe even more like 125,000. And I think about the repetitive and manual nature of the work in the studio seems like an apt metaphor for the time and labor that go into lawn care as well. That's another thing that's very repetitive and involves a lot of manual labor. So for this work, I included some process images on this slide. I use a series of plaster molds. Hold on a second. Excuse me. So these are plaster press molds that I use to create the work. And for this work, timing is really essential, as I have to get the timing of the grass blades perfect. They have to firm up and then get planted into these softer slabs of clay. And then here's some images of the pieces getting glazed. Here's a detail showing the modular nature of the work, as well as the shape and texture of the grass blades. So when I was developing this work, I spent maybe about 3 months just testing different glazes and glaze surfaces to be able to get the perfect kind of emerald green. I wanted to evoke a really rich, lush, summery, perfect lawn in this work. And then here's an even closer detail. I paid a lot of attention to things like the edges of the grass, the shape of the grass, the thinness at the top of the grass was really important to create that sense of a freshly cut lawn. Here's a later piece that was shown at the Fort Smith Regional Art Museum. One thing I like to play around is adding negative space into these lawn pieces to evoke sidewalks and driveways, and to, in a way, kind of invite the viewers into the space. Only visually. The work is incredibly fragile, so if you actually were to walk into it, it would break, and that has happened. This work has also been a lot about repair and replacement of broken pieces. So this work reflects my interest not only in lawns as a unifying feature of landscape, but also how digital technologies have changed our perception of landscape. Using digital mapping programs to navigate, we can simultaneously be above and in the landscape as we move through it. Looking to Google Maps to find shapes of houses, sidewalks, and driveways in my town allows me to play with the viewer's perception of scale and space. So in this one, I've left space for sidewalks, driveways, garages, and houses. So I have sort of 2 house plots here, evoking a sort of never-ending suburban lawn space. And here's another view of that same space. And I'm really interested too in sort of the narrative that we tell ourselves about lawn, and the way that this creates this kind of like shared domestic space, and then also very socially regulated space. So there's an early landscape philosopher who says, when smiling lawns and tasteful cottages begin to embellish a country, we know that order and culture are established. So I think it's really interesting that from the beginning, there's this connection between lawns being an indicator of order and culture. And it's so fascinating that we sort of chose to do that as a country rather than to plant orderly gardens, right, to fill our front yards. Other bodies of work using materials like asphalt, concrete, and shredded tires, in contrast with delicate porcelain plants and flowers, examine themes of environmental degradation and imbalance. The poet Joyelle McSweeney's theory of the necro-pastoral has been hugely influential on these works. In her writing, she posits that we can no longer experience an idealized version of nature without also experiencing the pollution and degradation that humans have wrought upon it. These works are less literal, creating evocative and poetic spaces of loss and death that reckon with the impacts of the Anthropocene, pitting formal arrangement and geometry with man's domination over nature. I think it's interesting, visually, my compositions tend to oscillate between the imposition of unnatural order and then the sort of entropy of decay and chaos. And this particular composition is really influenced by my research and investigations into French formal garden design. But instead of having grass here, I have giant hunks of concrete with delicate flowers and plants kind of laid on top. The necropastoral is a strange meeting place for the poet and death, or for the dead to meet the dead, or for the seemingly singular-bodied human to be revealed as part of an inhuman, multiple body. It is a sublime sight, a sight of soaring flights and subterranean swoons. And that's another quote from Joelle McSweeney. I happen to be married to a poet, so text and poetry comes a lot into my work and it influences a lot of the work that I do. So this is another piece that's kind of investigating that idea of imbalance and decay. And here in the center, there's thousands and thousands of little tiny porcelain grubs. And I almost imagine these like fragmented statuesque hands, sort of as one of the only relics of the human existence besides concrete and broken structures. In this space, just kind of like calling together an army of grubs. In my exploration of both formal and informal landscapes, I noticed the public parks and courthouse squares around me, replete with grassy lawns, trimmed hedges, and carefully arranged flower beds, focusing the eye on a central lone figure. So this is an image of a city square in Bentonville, Arkansas, that has had actually a Confederate statue in the center. I'm going to read a quote next from Lizzie Pollard. So she was the first president of the Southern Memorial Association, which was founded by a group of 38 Fayetteville women. So Fayetteville is fairly close to Bentonville. She says, "These monuments we build will speak their message to generations. These voiceless marbles in their majesty will stand as vindicators of the Confederate soldier. They will lift from these brave men the opprobrium of rebel and stand them in the line of patriots. This is not alone a labor of love, it is a work of duty as well. We are correcting history." So I think that it's really interesting that from the beginning, there was this indication, an intention that these monuments were a way of changing the narrative around the Civil War and around the sort of traitorous actions of the Confederates. And this big push to erect monuments all over the South was a way of trying to rebrand really the Confederacy. And you know, in her quotation, she says, "We are correcting history." Now, 120 years later, people across the country are questioning the history that these monuments represent. Quotes like this make it clear that these monuments were part of a larger effort to reframe the legacy of the Confederacy. And could everyone just double check and make sure their mics are on mute, please? Thank you. Due to a lot of public protests, this monument was actually removed a couple months ago. In my current home of Arkansas, there are over 50 Confederate monuments. Many are placed in prominent locations, such as in front of courthouses or in public squares. In name, these monuments were erected to commemorate the fallen soldiers of the losing side of the Civil War, as well as to reframe the Confederacy's stance as noble and heroic. In reality, most of these monuments were erected 50 or more years after the war, while Jim Crow laws were being passed all over the South to strip rights from African Americans. And so one thing I really think about is what message this sends in our public spaces. And thinking about the way that these monuments really declare a lot of these public spaces as being inherently white spaces and in some ways kind of off limits for Black people and people of color, right? So it's a subtle sign, I think, of disrespect and a sort of a reminder that certain people don't belong in public spaces. These monuments represent a thinly veiled ideology of racial separatism and white supremacy. While many cities and towns are considering removing or relocating the monuments, a number of state legislatures are passing laws that make that difficult or impossible. Many of the monuments were erected by the Daughters of the Confederacy. In addition to erecting monuments, the Daughters of the Confederacy was also active in promoting the lost cause through educational materials such as school textbooks. Similar efforts have been going on in Arkansas today as legislatures have introduced laws that would seek to limit teachers' abilities to teach social justice. Luckily, the recent attempt at that failed. But I think it's really kind of interesting that a lot of these conversations are still going on, and a lot of these same efforts are still happening here in Arkansas. As a white woman who grew up in the South, I have to ask myself, what is my complicity in the current state of my country? If not me personally, then how has my demographic behaved and what can I do to change that? This became the primary motivation to begin a new body of work. Some of the work in this series addresses the lost cause directly, while other parts of the work address the imagery and history of monuments in a more general way, but imagining them as having already fallen in a state of future fragmentation. And that's what you'll see with a lot of the work that's in the Spiva Gallery right now. My most recent work explores monuments through 3 visual themes: text inscriptions, broken obelisks, and fragments of equestrian statues. So that is horses with riders. As I continue to research these monuments, one of the first things I noticed and became interested in was their use of language. And so I began working on some text-based wall pieces, which you'll see a number of in the exhibition. For example, here's some text from one of the monuments that I collected. Furl that banner true, 'tis gory, yet 'tis wreathed around with glory, and will live in song and story, though its folds are in the dust. In my work, I think of cutting up monument text as a way of removing the order and intent of the author, while rearranging the text brings new context and content to the words. My intention with this work is to provide a counter narrative to the Confederate monuments. I view the text of these public monuments as shared cultural property that is outdated and in need of revision. So in the spirit of Dada and Surrealist poetry, who use—
Look at this, surprise.
Do you have a question?
Oh, sorry.
So I used a random cut up generator to mix up the text, and then I selected phrases from that to create a new text that was still contain the sense of solemnity and formality of the original. But as I kind of looked through the words, I searched for phrases that emphasized the sense of violence and loss caused by war, as well as the universal themes of family, memory, and death that are more relatable to a larger amount of people. Using historic fonts, I created digital files on Adobe Illustrator and then sent them to a digital plotter cutter and cut the text into sheets of sticky vinyl. I used the sheets of vinyl to create stencils, which masked off the background while I brushed on layers of shellac. So here's some images from a residency that I did at the Hambidge Center in Rabun Gap, Georgia. So in spring of 2019, I was on a sabbatical and created a lot of the work that's in the exhibition. So this was my first artist residency during sabbatical, and I really focused on the text work. So you can see kind of all over the studio, I have a lot of slabs laid out. I wait for them to get fairly hard, sort of at a hard leather, hard stage. And then you can see this sort of shiny areas here are the shellac that I've stenciled on. So the shellac acts as a resist to protect the lettered areas. So then I just take a large sponge and kind of like slowly wash away and wipe away the background clay, which leaves the raised letters behind. And again, you know, I mentioned that process is really important to me, and I liked the idea of using the process of shellac resist and just kind of wiping and removing material. And I thought of this as a way of kind of like cleansing some of the text, removing its original intent through process. And then here are some of the finished pieces, and these are in the show. The ironic and subversive way that I'm engaging with these texts is subtle and requires a careful reading on the part of the viewer. Phrases like "weep their banner of monument, commends the proud unknown sons, lifeless with honors," evoke a blind patriotism that, when followed, leads to sorrow and death. My text suggests that following this lost cause leads to a loss of identity and self, rather than the proud and hoped for victory. Some viewers have assumed that my engaging with this material is an implicit support of its message. Others have accused me of erasing history. And others have understood that I'm working to acknowledge the deep cultural wounds this material represents. Obelisks also feature prominently in this body of work. Many of Rome's famous piazzas feature obelisks. These are all part of Rome's tradition of spolia. So that is taking monuments or statuary fragments from other places and incorporating them into new monuments. Rome has 8 Egyptian obelisks taken from various sites after Egypt was annexed into the Roman Empire. Others were commissioned as copies and then brought to Rome. So here you can see this one is in front of St. Peter's. This one is actually in a piazza that's kind of adjacent to the backside of the Pantheon. And so you can see the dome of the Pantheon right here. And then this one is from Piazza Navona. So this has a really famous fountain created by Bernini down at the bottom underneath this Egyptian hieroglyph covered obelisk. So in this work, I'm thinking about the obelisk as a symbol for colonialism in a way, and also in this particular piece, thinking of using the form as a way of exploring the idea of blight. So with those ideas in mind, I fractured and hollowed out the obelisk form to reveal kind of a dark and lightless center. So there are a lot of different uses for the word blight. So in biology, blight is a rapid and complete chlorosis, browning, then death of plant tissues, such as leaves, branches, twigs, or floral organs. But we also use the word to describe things like urban blight, which was a way of kind of describing the negative impact of certain residents in city neighborhoods as a way of kind of justifying the removal of Blacks and other minorities from certain parts of the cities by sort of designating these areas as being blighted and then designating them for redevelopment and gentrification. It's a way of kind of enforcing urban racial segregation. So I was thinking about some of those ideas. And I was also thinking about sort of my own experience and different symbols that connected to the idea of the American dream. And I really think about apples and apple pie as something that's very sort of representative of the American dream in my mind. So when we bought our house about 5 or 6 years ago, there were several apple trees in the backyard, and I was really excited about that. I just had this sense of like kind of hope and promise. I do a lot of gardening and growing things, and I love the idea of using the land around me as a way to create nourishment. But then I realized that my trees were infected with fire blight. So it's like each year the trees flower and then begin to set fruit, and then slowly everything shrivels and turns brown. And I just thought, oh, this kind of reminds me of like a lot of people's experience of the American dream. You just have this hope that through hard work and perseverance, you're going to be able to have a prosperous life. I think it doesn't always work out that way, especially for certain citizens. So I collected fallen, blighted apple leaves from the trees in my backyard and dipped them in porcelain and then burned the leaves away. So all around this monument are sort of accumulations of these windswept, blighted porcelain apple leaves from my tree. So I wanted to create just a sense of kind of like sadness and hopelessness and desolation in this piece. Here are some studio shots. This is made out of porcelain paper clay. So I use a lot of slab building in my work. During the summer, I don't have any classes that I teach in the ceramic studio. So that's usually a great time for me to just take over and make some large pieces. So this is a little view into the ceramic studio at the University of the Ozarks. And you can see over here, this is the top of the obelisk before it has been ripped apart. And then just here's a little shot of some slip dipped pieces. So I use a deflocculated casting slip with paper pulp in it for my slip dipping. It's really messy, but I love the way it allows me to engage directly with the natural world and to collect specimens and preserve them almost as fossils. And so in some of the work that's influenced by the necropastoral that I showed earlier, I use the slip dipping technique quite a lot. And I love going out and kind of foraging for different types of plants that relate to the theme of the work that I'm doing and then slip dipping those. A lot of them break, it's really fragile. So I always just kind of make tons and then choose the best ones for the pieces. So here's another piece that incorporates obelisk and slip dipped forms. Here, these are native grasses that are slip dipped, kind of assembled into a defensive barrier. And I was thinking about that sense of defensiveness and fear that goes around about this sort of perceived loss of Southern white culture and white power. And then this sculpture employs the obelisk form in its entirety, but here the form has been tarred and feathered. And I like how the crisp contours of the obelisk form are kind of obscured by this halo of feathers. And as you can see, like I'm kind of interested in using material and surface to evoke different emotions. So I wanted to evoke a little bit of a sense of disgust with this piece. Tarring and feathering is an action typically dispensed outside the law to induce public shame and humiliation in the recipient. So it was actually used by colonists around the time of the American Revolution to express their anger with British officials, but the tradition goes back to medieval Europe. And often pine tar, pine sap was used. It's incredibly sticky substance. So I've tried to replicate that in a more easy to preserve way in this piece. So it actually uses resin that's been colored with burnt umber. After making a few obelisk pieces and starting the text-based work, I set off for a residency in Rome for 5 weeks. I was interested in tracing the visual lineage of some of these monuments and like seeing the origin of some of the forms. So seeing the rich visual history of Rome, the textures, the colors, and then this very casual way that artifacts and architectonic fragments are arranged in the landscape inspired me to create a series of works that imagined broken and fallen monuments in this historic context. So kind of going back to that image of the Piazza Minerva della Sapienza. This was an Egyptian obelisk brought to Rome by Diocletian for the nearby Temple of Isis. And then it was kind of lost and then found again in the 1600s and erected here onto this elephant base with a sculpture by Bernini. So this piece was actually right around the corner from my studio, maybe like a 5-minute walk. So this is the proportion and shape that I used to create this piece. So I created another slab-built obelisk and then carried it around to various locations in Rome to shoot a series of photographs. And so this one is down by the sort of banks of the Tiber River. There's a cobbled walkway there, but I loved the way that the lines of the walkway sort of created a sense of crossroads. And I really worked to age the surfaces of my sculpture so that they would really kind of connect to the weathered, stained surfaces in Rome. I was really drawn to iconic locations within the landscape of Rome, like the Tiber River, which flows through the city. I was thinking about the way these known locations, these historic locations kind of compress time. How many other people have stood on the shores of this river? What sort of things has it washed away with its flow? What relics lay submerged beneath its salty bed? The Tiber is rich with history. Even next to beautiful and ancient bridges, the banks are full of trash and detritus. Here, the monuments I created became just another marker of the Anthropocene, made and then discarded. So you can see there's just like detergent bottles and juice bottles and weird like metal sticking out of the ground and water bottles. And then here's a piece of the obelisk. So I did a shoot and set my pieces up, and I actually just left them there overnight. And when I came back, one of the pieces had actually been washed away by the river. And then I found one chunk over here and another one here. And I had some really interesting conversations too with random passerbys that I met who thought that I had actually discovered some ancient monuments. I continued this theme at another residency in Denmark. So this is at Guliago International Ceramics Research Center. And I was continuing to think back to that idea of Roman spolia and imagining obelisks as deeply tied to place, right? Because they're a large piece of stone that's been quarried from a specific location, a specific landscape. So they each convey that unique geology and sense of place. So this ceramics residency had an incredible selection of different kinds of clays. So I tried to use a little bit of every kind of clay and make obelisks from a variety of different types of clay, and then place them again in different locations. This was actually a duck pond. I was able to get a shot without the ducks swimming through. The residency is in an old apple estate, so there's kind of leftover orchards and gardens all around it. And I love this shot, the way that the grass is just kind of covering over the pieces. And so you can really feel like they're almost being sucked back into the landscape. So here's the final installation. I convinced a bunch of the other residents to help me dig up a giant piece of the lawn and bring it into the gallery. So I've created an installation that's sort of reminiscent of like a park or a cemetery. The overgrown grass evoking a sense of neglect or forgetfulness. And then the obelisks were sculpted to have a sense of like a tilt or lean to them to convey that sense of kind of like sinking or falling into the ground. And then their short height changes our physical relationship to the form. So we suddenly become much taller than they are, rather than the obelisk towering over us. Scale is something I like to play around a lot in my work with, as you can see. Through my depictions of the obelisk as broken or misplaced, the form is liberated from its fabricated existence, free to crumble and decay into its natural material state. And then the third theme in this body of work is the Equestrian Monument, which I mentioned earlier. Used since classical times to commemorate leaders with a sense of power and authority, the horse and rider is also a common theme in Confederate monuments, especially to depict General Robert E. Lee. Ancient Roman equestrian statues, as well as more recent Confederate monuments made in the same tradition, enforce a rigid hierarchy. So you have the rider who's in control of his horse. So in a way, sort of man over nature. And then he also towers over us, the viewers. We become the humble subjects or even the conquered enemies, our soft bodies defenseless against a fierce kick or a violent trampling by the horse's sharp hooves. And then I included an image here on the left. I don't know if any of you have been following what's been happening. So over this past summer, there's really been a reckoning about the monuments that we have in our country. And a lot of them have started coming down or being defaced. And I think it's really interesting the way that this has become revised through text and graffiti. It's become a site of protest. Artists have been using it to project messages that connect to the social justice protests that have been happening. So here's me as a resident artist at Creta, Rome. My studio was just a short walk away from the Campidoglio, which is a Renaissance era piazza designed by Michelangelo that showcases a reconstruction of the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius. And then actually just kind of over to the side over here, this hill overlooks the Roman Forum and gives you a really great historic view. And there are several other equestrian statues flanking the stairway that go up to that piazza, because you kind of go up this grand stairway. So I did a lot of documentation and observation, and I was, again, like I mentioned, really drawn to the legs and hooves of the statues, thinking about that as being this embodiment of swiftness and speed, but also kind of the center of danger. And because these statues are all on pedestals, they're really lifted above you. So you really can get that feeling that these could kick you in the face at any minute. And kind of connecting to that sense of trampling or being crushed. On the left, there's actually, this is kind of interesting. It's an Amazon warrior crushing with her horse, her enemies on the left. And then an image of student marchers being attacked in Selma, Alabama during the civil rights movement in the US by a cop on horseback. So here are some of the leg and hoof fragments that I created and photographed. And in fact, when I was documenting this piece is about, you can't see that, about 24 inches tall, maybe. So it's pretty big and massive. And as I was shooting this, I was down by the river, and there's kind of a taller river bank kind of next to it, an embankment. And this guy comes by and he looks at me and he starts yelling in Italian, "È vero," which means like, "Is that real?" And he thought that I had found like a real bronze monument fragment. And he started saying like, "Oh, you know, we need to collect it. We need to preserve it." And he was like running around trying to find some plastic that we could wrap it up in. I can speak a little bit of Italian, not that well. So I had to kind of convince him in my broken Italian that no, like this was a sculpture that I had created and was looking at the monuments around. And he just came over and like shook my hand really hard. But one of the fun things about doing this work was the kind of performative aspect of it, meeting different people and having conversations about the imagery and the sculptures that I was creating. So here's me. I've just got my backpack on, which I would fill with sculptures and kind of roam around the city. So here's a hill kind of near the botanical garden outside of Rome. Was looking for some other sites that would be capture that sense of age and time and history. So this is actually a Roman pedestal that I photographed some other fragmentary parts on. And I was really thinking about that sense of wandering and discovering. And I wanted my fragments to be almost indistinguishable from those of antiquity. I wanted the pieces to feel lost, almost shipwrecked. The fragments taken out of their original context and hierarchy, consumed by the landscape, just fragments without a story. In all of this work, I wanted to leave space for the viewer to fill in the gaps and to create their own history or narrative through the images. And so during COVID, I got locked out of my ceramic studio at school for about 8 months, which was really frustrating, but I was able to utilize a lot of the documentation and images and some of the work that I had at home with me to continue working. And I have been working on these composite collage images, sort of using monument fragments and the plaques to create a sense of speculative history. And I haven't really shown any of these works yet, but I wanted to, because they're kind of still under development, sort of show you where I'm going with this work. So I have an equestrian sculpture that was inspired by a sculpture from the Capitoline Hill on Rome, text remixed from Arkansas Monuments together in one. And so they start to narrate this story of discovery, violence, and survival. And so this plaque says, "The rise of cannon, buried future barrel, conquered live person in faithfulness, generations sacrifice, earth survivors." And this particular one was created for a project called Monuments to Escape. It was a postcard book curated by an artist, Marisa Williamson. And so she's collected different speculative monuments that artists have created as a way of sort of reimagining what the meaning of monument is and sort of how we can go forward, what deserves to have a monument, what form should it take, how can we reinvent that. As I excerpt and fragment these monuments in their words, I'm interested in compressing time and history and in foregrounding the eventual despair and loss of meaning that comes to all monuments. Moving forward with this work, I'm excited about the possibility for speculation, fabrication, and narrative that exists in these photographs.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was it. So I just have a slide with some information about upcoming panel that I'm doing. I don't know if anyone's gonna attend in SICA, but I'm doing a virtual panel discussion called Written in Clay, Subtext, Power, and Ambiguity. So if I have any clay people, I would love for you to log into that. And then I'm happy to take any questions or comments or thoughts that people have.
Are there any questions?
What's your favorite thing about pottery?
My favorite thing, well, I usually say that I make sculpture and not pottery. I think about pottery as being connected more to functional work. But I think the thing that I love most about working in clay is the absolute malleability and sense of possibility that clay gives you, that you can create almost anything you can imagine with it, and that it's in the same way very humble and not too expensive. So it makes me feel really free to work with.
Nice.
What originally drew you to this theme of landscape and sort of the Anthropocene?
I think You know, it's one of those sort of like things that slowly burned within me, I guess, throughout my creative practice. As an undergrad, my work was more vessel-based, right? But as I kind of moved forward, and I think it was partly living in different parts of the country and seeing how urban planning affected the way that we move through city spaces, it started to make me think about the way that we shape landscape in different places and what that reflects about us. If you have ever lived in a city that was designed before cars were created, it has a really different feeling than one that was built, like a lot of the southern cities, to accommodate cars. And so I think that was what sort of planted the first seed of that. But I've also just always been interested in the way that landscape has been used in narratives, like thinking about fairy tales, using the landscape of forest to create this place that is mysterious or dangerous, or that involves a quest. And then to kind of answer the part about the Anthropocene, I think, you know, my entire life, I was raised by hippie parents who would find me if I left the lights on in a room. We recycled everything and like lived on seaweed and tofu and brown rice. So thinking about our impact on the natural world is something that I've always done, that I just learned to do from a young age. And so sort of slowly connecting my interest in landscape and my interest in environmentalism and thinking about the way that we're really shaping and affecting the world has just kind of come together in deeper and more profound ways as I continue to work as an artist.
Hi. Actually, I like all your art, how you used it with the landscape, but what got you exposure as an undergrad?
What got me exposure as an undergrad? That's a good question. I'm ending my slideshow. I think that, you know, I really didn't start showing my work much as an undergrad. I had a few exhibitions that were connected to my university. And then after I graduated, I moved back to Atlanta and became friends with and moved into an alternative art space. And so sort of within about 6 months of graduating, I was part of this really great community of artists. And so in our space, we had a 5,000 square foot loft, and we lived there, and we had maybe like a 2,000 square foot gallery. And so we curated exhibitions together. There were like 4 to 5 artists that lived there. We had studio space, and we had kind of like an art commune. And we also had theater performances, comedy performances, music performances. So we really worked together to build a space for emerging artists and to kind of create the community that we wanted. And so I think that was a really essential part of my early artistic development, is to be part of that alternative art space. And in Atlanta at that time, there were lots of interesting art spaces where people were coming together just to kind of create this exciting zeitgeist and provide opportunities for all different kinds of kind of out there experimental art. And then at the same time, I also got like a studio apprenticeship at a local community arts center. And that was for 2 years. And that gave me regular exhibitions, a small studio space, and access to kilns, clay, and glazes. So it's like the combination of those two things really gave me like these, this a great jumping off point to start my creative career.
So it got you like, I see being surrounded by that art gave you like many different perspectives on it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'm a very community oriented person. Like I love being around other people that are doing exciting work. And so to kind of have that energy of like, oh, what are you working on? What are you doing? Or thinking about like, okay, what artists do we want to invite to show their work here in our space? was just like a really, really good energy. I think it's really important to think about who you surround yourself with. Are you around people that just like want to play video games all day? Are you around people that are like, oh, I'm really excited about my artwork and I need to lock myself in the studio for 12 hours this weekend?
Yeah, I'm like half and half on video games and art right now, but yeah.
Yeah, well, you got to find a balance. But I think it's really important, at least for me, it was to have that creative energy from the other people around me as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for answering the question.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? I had a question, and I think that you kind of addressed this when you were talking about the issue with the monuments here in the States. But whenever I see the Forum in Rome, and I've been there a few times now, I approach the space with, I'm in awe. However, I do know the blood, sweat, and tears that went into building some of those monuments and some of the trauma that surrounds that. How do you resolve that within your own work as that being part of it, as that being something that inspired it to a degree?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that it's only addressed kind of obliquely. And that's something that I'm really kind of asking myself as well about the Confederate work, is if I'm addressing it directly enough in the work. And so my intention by fragmenting and discarding and kind of recomposing images, with the new text and with the fragments, was to get at that sense of impermanence and decay and destruction. But I think that it doesn't quite get to the sort of energy and anguish and intensity that went into the actual construction of the pieces, because I'm so focused on sort of deconstructing them. But I guess my intent in deconstructing and sort of recontextualizing the pieces is to sort of disempower their message and sort of remove that intent of empire and colonialism from the original monuments. But I think that that's something that I'm still working to do in a more strong and direct way. I think that in my work, I tend to really gravitate towards ambiguity, and that can be dangerous when you're working with certain subject matter, if you don't come down strongly enough with your message. So that's a line that I'm trying to walk in the work.
Yes. However, I do think often subtlety is a approach that's more effective, especially with viewers that might not know the history of, potentially what might surround it. So,
well, I usually get turned off by work that like kind of smashes you over the head with its message.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So it's sort of like, how can you engage with this history and legacy and sort of lineage of violence, and also make sure that you aren't seeming to in some way condone it. So I'm hoping that in some way, like combining the images with the text pieces is helping to do that in the work.
Any other questions? Nope. Well, thank you very much. It was a great talk, and I'm looking forward to seeing the show. I have not had a chance to, because I can't be on campus right now, but looking forward to it. And if you haven't had a chance to see the show, it's up and it's open, and you can contact me with any questions that you might have for Dawn, and I can relay them to her. So.
Yeah, and I certainly, if anyone has any questions or wants to contact me or ask me anything, you know, you're welcome to get my email and send me a message. I'm always happy to connect to young artists. So anyway, thank you all so much for coming and being a great audience and for having wonderful questions. I hope you all have a great week.
Thank you. I have everyone's names for attendance or extra credit. And Dawn, if you could hold for just a moment.